The Buffalo Bills did not make much of an investment in the wide receiver position in the 2025 draft. Is that a trend that we should expect to continue? We're discussing that this week on the Wandering Buffalo podcast.
You're now listening to the Wandering Buffalo podcast with your host, Justin Goddard.
Bills Mafia, welcome into another episode of the Wandering Buffalo podcast, a show on the Buffalo FamBase podcast network. My name is Justin, and I am your host. And today I want to take a look at the wide receiver position. And if you've been listening to the show, this is kind of a topic that I have wanted to get to for the past few weeks, but there's been some different Bills news, Bills related stuff happening. The schedule release came out, and this is kind of one of those off-season topics that we can really get to whenever. So try to keep the show timely and appropriate with what's going on in the Bills world, especially coming out once a week. And no crazy news this week. So conversation that we get to have this week, and this kind of thought process and wanting to dive a little bit more into the wide receiver position came from all of the conversations this offseason, the Brandon Beane on WGR, just a lot of fans wanting us to draft a receiver, right? A more contribute more assets to the receiver position. We'll say that because they did draft a receiver. It just wasn't until the 7th round. We added a receiver, but it wasn't a huge name, a household name. It was Joshua Palmer. So there have been investments made in position, but I think for quite a few years now, there's been a contingency of Bills fans that wanted us to go after a marquee receiver in free agency or be able to trade up into the draft and get one of these guys. A couple of years ago, it was Brian Thomas Jr. Was a big name of should the Bills be trading up. So I kind of wanted to take a look at what has happened with the position and kind of follow Brandon Beane's philosophy and get an idea of where I think he places the value when we're talking about the offense, specifically the wide receiver room, and I guess kind of trends of where the league is headed. So we're going to get into that today. And first off the top here, I want to kind of just dismiss the notion that Brandon Beane has not made significant investments into the position. Over just the last few drafts, we saw Keon Coleman a year ago. Before that, Dalton Kincaid. And I understand he's not a receiver, but just thinking back to the press conferences after, it was very clear that he was, drafted as a pass catcher and not your traditional inline tight end. And that's a first and second round pick just over the last 3 years. I want to start this conversation with Dalton Kincaid and kind of just the value of tight ends in this league. And I think part of this conversation of the Bills needed to draft a receiver over the last couple of years, particularly this draft, stems from wanting more from Dalton Kincaid. And I think that's an okay conversation to have. I think last year was a bit of a disappointing season for him. And I think it was a lot to do with expectations of him being a first round pick, him coming in his rookie year and having top 10 year for rookie tight ends and just kind of expecting him to explode, Diggs no longer being in the mix, all of these targets being freed up, yada, yada, yada. I think we expected a huge step from Kincaid last year, and be it injuries, some weird timing stuff with Josh Allen, missing some plays in key moments. I think as a fan base, it's fair to say, and with fair reason, that we are a little bit down on Kincaid. I'm looking at this from the perspective of if he's able to stay healthy, recapture that rookie year form, and grow, of what he can mean to this team. And I'm also looking at that through the lens of he's still fairly new to football, and looking at, we talk about this all the time, all of these players that really had taken big steps in their third year under Brandon Beane. And we can look at that from a number of perspectives, but you know the list, all these players that we've had on the team that have really broken out in their third year. And I think that you can expect that to some extent with Dalton Kincaid. So then I kind of take the conversation a step further. And this is something that I've discussed many times on this show about Brandon Beane, and under Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott, the Bills have kind of been one of the teams that are a little bit ahead of the curve on some of these league trends and where things are headed. And we saw that with kind of like the too high shell on defense that pretty much everybody is doing to an extent to, really limit plays down the field. We've seen that for years with the Bills primarily running nickel and being willing to be lighter on defense and really try to limit teams in the passing game and allow some rushing yards. We see that with the defensive line, and we see it again this year. A lot of us were screaming for a one-tech defensive lineman run stuffer, and we see the Bills again. They double dipped at defensive tackle, and they still didn't take your traditional one-tech guy. And I think that we see this to an extent with the offensive side of the ball. And we see this with, having a unicorn at quarterback and still kind of leaning into a balanced attack of not throwing every down and having the run game involved. And we see it with these bigger sets when we're bringing in that 6 offensive linemen to play tight end. We see it with kind of the move to more 2 tight end sets. And I think it's going to be even a further extent, maybe 3 tight end sets this year with the addition of Jackson Hawes. And I think this is to an extent kind of a counter to league defenses being so focused on stopping the pass that the run game has become more effective again. And this even branches out to whether or not you want to pay James Cook. And personally, I go back and forth on where I land on this because I think he is a super effective weapon when teams are focused on stopping the pass so much that he can really hurt you on the ground. Now, the other side of that argument is with this offensive line and the depth to go with it, it's more about, the blocking than the running back themselves. And I can see that to an extent. But this brings me to kind of the bulk of my conversation here. And that is kind of the valuation of receivers in today's NFL, and kind of comparing that to the valuation of tight ends. And was this move drafting Kincaid kind of intentional versus giving up assets and future draft picks to go get one guy in the draft in, we'll say, a Brian Thomas, versus being able to move up a little bit, get a Dalton Kincaid, who is going to be listed as a tight end. But all the messaging coming out of the Bills organization after the draft is basically this guy's going to be a wide receiver. So I'm kind of looking at this through the lens of league trends, contract valuations, and where tight ends stack up versus the wide receivers. And this is done through the lens of teams looking to get not one but two of these marquee guys. And I'm going to use the Bengals for this example. I think the other example of this showing how it can work would be the Philadelphia Eagles, obviously paying both Devonta Smith and A.J. Brown, also paying running back Saquon Barkley. I don't know where they keep coming up with all these funds, still having a stellar defense, and coming off winning a Super Bowl. Oh, and they're paying Jalen Hurts. They're doing a lot of fun cap gymnastics, and I think Howie Roseman could kind of be the exception here. I think he's been year in and year out one of the league's best GMs, maybe the best. But constantly restocking the stable with young defensive talent and being willing to move on from defensive talent to not have to pay on that side of the ball, and it working. So looking at the top tight ends, I have the top 10, and these are all average annual value for both the tight ends and the wide receiver contract numbers. I used over the cap to get the values. So looking at your top 10 tight ends, we have George Kittle coming in, 19.1 AAV. Trey McBride, 19 million. Kelsey, 17. Hawkinson, 16.5. Mark Andrews, 14. David Njoku, 13.7. Cole Kmet, 12.5. Pat Freiermuth, 12.1. Dalton Schultz, 12 million. And Evan Ingram, 11.5. And that's your top 10 tight ends. Projecting out, if Dalton Kincaid kind of hits his ceiling, kind of being able to apply maybe a little bit of a value contract, because we see Beane constantly getting these done. If you're talking about a Dalton Kincaid extension, what are we talking about? Maybe the 16, 17 range. Maybe we're talking about him being a top 5, top 10 tight end in the league. I think the value that you can get from that contract when you then move over to the wide receiver position and kind of look at the top values there, I think it's a little bit different to be able to have that marquee tight end and have them be one of your top 2 options in the passing game, and treat that as your quote unquote wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, and then compare it to similar money for wide receivers. So kind of looking at the top end of the receiver money, and like I said, everybody's trying to get, 2 of these marquee guys, because one top receiver is seemingly not enough, as defenses are able to key in and kind of take away that guy. You're looking at, first of all, you got the over 40 club, Jamar Chase coming in there. And then all of these receivers over $30 million. Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, DK Metcalf, A.J. Brown, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Tyreek Hill, and Brandon Ayuk, all over $30 million average value. When we kind of move that scale to the similar to top tight end money, you still have some dudes here. Mike Evans, albeit he's aging, he comes in at 20.5. Christian Kirk, 18. Jerry Jeudy, 17.5. Cooper Kupp, 15. Cortland Sutton, 13.7. Khalil Shakir, 13.2. And these are all dudes that are kind of lining up to some of that top 10 tight end money. So I kind of look at this from the value of the contracts compared to the others. And Khalil Shakir making this list is kind of, I use this as he's a dude on our team, and I think that could be a really good value contract that he could still have more growth and be a more impactful player, and we're looking at that contract as a steal in a couple of years. But him sitting in that range and fans still wanting, one of those marquee guys, you start looking at how all the money adds up together. You add in maybe Keon Coleman hits his ceiling, and we're talking $20+ million for him. And it just starts to be, for me, a conversation of how much money are you willing to invest into the position or pass catchers in general and still be able to field the remainder of your roster. And I think the approach here for Brandon Beane is kind of making your selection of some of these more value contracts and pairing that with maybe a top tight end contract and still coming away, with less than you might pay just one of these receivers with where the league is going, let alone trying to have two of them. And let's slot in Dalton Kincaid, say he, is getting towards his ceiling and he hits something like, we'll call it 15 million average annual value. Other contracts coming in the meantime can affect that number. His play itself could warrant a higher number. Maybe he gets up into the 20 range. But let's say 15, combine that with Khalil Shakir coming in at around 13 million. Now you're at 28. And you can add two more of these value guys and still be coming away with the value of one wide receiver. Now I'm taking that a step further, and I told you I was going to use a team like the Bengals and where they're at cap-wise and what they're paying their offensive weapons. So just kind of looking at their big three, we're ignoring your, rest of the wide receiver depth chart. We're going to ignore running back. And we are just looking at Burrow, Chase, and T. Higgins. And I don't think there's many people out there that will argue the talent of these three players, argue the success they're able to have on offense. Joe Burrow's an awesome quarterback. Those are awesome receivers. We're also looking at a team that, due to, there's injuries in there, there's defensive play letting them down. We're looking at a team who each of the last 2 years has missed the playoffs. That was before the T. Higgins extension. T. Higgins getting in the extension this year, coming in at an average annual value of just under 30. He's at average value 28.7. We have Burrow getting an average value of 55 million and Jamar Chase just over 40 million. Now I know there's also crafty ways to lever these contracts and have different values hit different years. For the ease of this conversation, we're just looking at the average value, and that adding up to a total of roughly $125 million between three players. Now, the NFL cap is set at just over $279 million this year. So using the Bengals as an example here, that puts them at roughly 45% of their cap. average values here again, being spent on 3 players. You still have to round out the rest of your 53-man roster, not including your practice squad, all that. You're still looking at rounding out another 50 guys under contract, and you've used roughly half your cap on 3 players. Now, I mentioned the Philadelphia Eagles, obviously the very far other end of the spectrum of this working for them, paying your quarterback, paying 2 receivers, paying your running back, and winning a Super Bowl. And hell, I'll be honest, if the Bills were able to make these exact same investments and you can tell me that they're going to win a Super Bowl, I will throw all of these theories out and sign me up for it to win one, and we could suck again for 10 years after that. The realistic nature here is, and we hear Brandon Beane talk about this quite often, of knocking at the door, give yourself as many bites at the apple and hopefully you get one. And the belief that you're staying as good as you can as long as you can, and hoping you're able to win one in that process. And that's kind of where I would fall philosophically, of being that department of being as good as you can as long as you can, and hopefully you win one. And unfortunately, at the rise of the Bills, dominance, we also have, Patrick Mahomes, Andy Reid, and the Chiefs muddying up the AFC. And that's a hump that you have to get over. But when I look at what the Bills have been able to assemble, it's not the offense that has gotten in their way of winning in these playoff games. And we've had different level of investments at the receiver position. And going back to just last year with this everybody eats philosophy, the Bills had the most efficient, most successful offense in team history. And we did that without this marquee big contract at wide receiver. We did that, having to move on from Stephon Diggs. And yes, we brought in Amari Cooper via trade, but he was not the same player, that the name recognition would suggest for this team. So we did this with the likes of Khalil Shakir, Matt Collins, a rookie Keon Coleman, a banged up Curtis Samuel. And you see a lot of these, mid-level contract investments that were able to get it done offensively. I think this is the philosophy that we will continue seeing for Brandon Beane. And a step further, I think that as these wide receiver contracts keep ballooning, we're going to see teams across the league not willing to pay 2 receivers in that money. Maybe it's something more like they have a receiver that's paid and they draft a guy, and as that player comes up for a rookie extension, you let the older guy go and keep resetting the deck there. Maybe it's leaning more into the tight end. Maybe it's leaning more into the running game. I think all of these scenarios that are kind of set up here kind of speak to the conversation that I'm having with Brandon Beane and kind of being ahead of the league trends. Now, in the meantime, does that, kind of hurt the ability of the Bills to compete at that top level? Maybe. I would have loved for, a Stephon Diggs to be able to be paired with one of these standout rookies and see what happens. But we're also looking at, the personalities that come into play there. When Stephon Diggs was still on the team and Joe Brady takes over as offensive coordinator, it seems to be that, embracing this everybody eats philosophy wasn't in Diggs's plans. And we see a lot of that personality in these top wide receivers, that They want their targets. So that's a whole nother layer of the locker room, the team building philosophy, the everybody having an impact on the team and not just relying on one guy to go get you a bucket. And I think that's some of the stuff that we don't get the pleasure of being in the locker room and seeing how everything, kind of comes together. We don't see how much that kind of attitude can affect Josh Allen. When I personally want Josh Allen to be the loudest voice in the room, the unquestioned leader, none of this who made who type conversation. And in the first year that we see Josh Allen not feeling like he has to force targets to Stephon Diggs, in a year that he's not trying to legitimize the organization's efforts to make Gabe Davis a number 2 receiver. We see him with the fewest turnovers in his career by a mile. We see the most efficient offense. And we did this with a group of guys at receiver that many of us thought could use huge upgrades. So going forward, do I think this necessarily precludes the Bills from making another big investment at receiver in the draft? Well, I think that depends on how things shake out. I think we still have a lot to see from Keon Coleman development-wise. I think we still see, does Dalton Kincaid take that step? And I'll say this, if Dalton Kincaid doesn't get hurt last year and, some of that chemistry and timing with Josh Allen is cleaned up a bit, I think if we see Keon Coleman not get hurt and finish the season on the trajectory that he was on, I'm not sure that we're even having this conversation right now. So let's give it time. Let's see how it all plays out. I don't think the Bills are opposed to paying one receiver that top money. We saw them trade significant assets and pay Diggs and continue to pay Diggs in restructured contracts. I think the appetite is there to pay one of these guys. I don't think the appetite exists for paying 2-3 of these guys. So, and I think that's where you end up with this system right now of some of these mid-range contracts in Joshua Palmer coming in Khalil Shakir getting a very reasonable contract for what I think his contributions not only are, but the ceiling of what they could be. And I think maybe you lump into that the plan of Keon Coleman takes that step, and he's the guy that you have to pay a massive contract. So just a whole bunch of thoughts on not only the Bills receiver position, but where I think the league might be headed, the trends that I think Brandon Beane might be trying to get ahead of, and just kind of an overview of looking at the implications of the money and, still being able to field the rest of your roster, pay your offensive line, be able to pay defensive players so you continue having an effective defense, or in this case, maybe have to retool and plan on future contracts with the defense. So a lot of thoughts going into this on, roster building philosophies, where the money should be allocated, where I think the league is headed. Lots of room for debate here. This episode more than ever, drop a comment. Let me know what your thoughts are on, some of these ideas. Let me know if you think that all of my ideas are completely stupid. Let me know if you agree. Let me know if you have different thoughts. This episode's made for conversation, so drop a comment. While you're there, like, share, subscribe, tell a friend about the episode if you enjoyed it. Appreciate all the help and support. I appreciate you being here as always. That's going to do it for this week's episode. We will see you next week. School is over for me. Gonna get back to a more consistent release date. So I appreciate you being here. Appreciate the subscriptions, following along. We will see you next week. Until then, and as always, go Bills.